It is now my honor to introduce the Executive Director of the Global and National Security Institute, retired United States Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. General McKenzie, a little too early. General McKenzie served in the Marine Corps for 42 years, retiring in 2022 as the commander of United States Central Command, one of 11 combatant commands in the U.S. military. He was directly responsible to the Secretary of Defense and the President for all military operations in the Central region, which includes the Greater Middle East, North Africa, and Central and South Asia. His extensive experience in the Middle East gives him a unique perspective and insight into the region, especially Iran. He has commanded at every level of the Marines, platoon, company, battalion, Marine Expeditionary Unit, and finally at CENTCOM. In addition to his role as Executive Director of the Global and National Security Institute, he is Executive Director of the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, also known as Cyber Florida. Please help me welcome General McKenzie.
Thanks, Dave, for that introduction. And it's my genuine pleasure to be with you here today. These policy dialogue events are an important part of what we want to do here at GNSI, to provide actionable solutions to 21st century security challenges for decision makers at the local, the state, the national, and the international level. I would echo the remarks that have already been made about the people that made this event come together, the various parts of the university, this great university that has been very supportive of GNSI and has enabled us to be where we are today. And I'm also particularly pleased with the crowd that we have here speaking today, the speakers, the panelists, all of you who are with us. We're delighted to have you here. We think this is going to be a meaningful session, and we appreciate the fact some of you have traveled great distances to be with us here today. So we've come here today to discuss Iran, the theocratic regime that maintains, and its theocratic regime that maintains absolute control over every aspect of its society and the influence it's been able to wield around the world. I spent a good portion of my life and most of my professional career studying the Middle East. I spent time in nearly all the countries in the region, and I have a lot of experience. And so I'm just going to begin our conversation today by talking a little bit about Iran to sort of lay some markers on the table that people who actually know far more about this than I will further develop as we go through the course of the day today. Let me begin by saying I believe this is the most dangerous period of time in the greater Middle East that I can recall, certainly as far back as October 1973. I continue to believe, and you've heard me say this in many public forums, that Iran remains the greatest danger and the greatest threat to peace in the region. Iran is a great power by no one's estimation. The country is ruled by a theocratic regime that is bad news for everyone, but it's also a regime that America has consistently underestimated and frequently overlooked because of wishful thinking that it'll just go away. It's not going to go away. Iran is an imperial culture that is thousands of years old, and it's going to continue to be an important country in the region for a long time. Iran will continue to increase its military power relative to its neighbors. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign failed to break Iran, and the Biden administration's softer approach is proving ineffective as well. Recognizing this, countries in the region are making their own accommodations with Iran. UAE and Saudi Arabia are just two, there are others. These are uneasy relationships, but they're all based on the growing uncertainty with which U.S. security guarantees are viewed. There are also practical reactions to the significant drawdown of U.S. capability in the region. The bottom line is this: Iran's going to weather the storm, and we need to find a way to integrate Iran into the region in a way that serves our purposes as well as theirs. That used to be the working definition of practical statecraft. I don't want to overstate the possibility of this happening. Iran will have to change if this is to happen, and most significantly, in their implacable campaign against Israel. I'll also note that the protests in Iran that we see from the winter of 22 throughout all of 23 until now, the protests on university campus, young people, it's my judgment, they're not capable of threatening the center of gravity of the Iranian state. In many ways, they're a false hope, and we draw much more hope from them here than people actually do in Iran, and we give them much more possibility of success than I think actually exists. So what are Iran's priorities? I think the number one priority of Iran remains the preservation of the theocratic regime. It's their top overarching strategic goal. So number two and number three rotate back and forth depending on day of the week, the mood, whatever. Number two typically is the destruction of the state of Israel, And number three is the ejection of the United States from the region. So when we think about Iran, we need to remember they see themselves as a revolutionary regime. And they're determined that their revolution is going to outlive the revolutionary generation without significant change. That's a rare occurrence. Seldom do revolutions outlive the revolutionary generation. We've seen that throughout history. We saw it with the French Revolution, and we saw the same thing happen with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia early in the 20th century. What followed that revolution with Lenin and Stalin were certainly not what the Bolsheviks envisioned when they came to power. The current regime in Iran understands this, and so they're determined to guarantee the survival of their revolution and allow it to flourish and export it throughout the region. The Iranians have been the primary financier, armory, and operations center for most terrorist groups and military proxies in the groups in the region. Groups like Hamas, groups like Lebanese Hezbollah, and of course the Houthis. Even though Hamas surprised Iran with the 7 October attack against Israel, make no mistake, Iran is morally responsible for the attack. They financed them, they armed them, and they trained them. Just as Iran continues to embolden violent extremist organizations throughout the region, it continues to increase its own military capabilities. We all know about Iran's desire for a nuclear weapon. I have a slightly different take on that, a different take from many of my intelligence briefers when I was the CENTCOM commander. Some of them may be seated in the room here, but I'm going to go ahead and they'll hear me say this again. I think the Iranians value the ability to build a nuclear weapon. It seems to me they value the idea more than the actual physical act of building one. By holding some degree of ambiguity in this process, they can leverage the United States, we dance to their tune, and also our European allies, always playing for more concessions, while staying coyly just below the threshold of breakout. In my opinion, what they really value, in my opinion, is their ballistic missile program. When considered with their relatively recent advances in land attack cruise missiles and unmanned aerial systems, they have almost 4,000 highly accurate weapons they could employ against their neighbors. Some of these weapons could reach Israel. We know from hard experience at Al-Assad and Ant Taff just how accurate Iranian weapons can be. When coupled with their ability to employ proxy forces in the near abroad, in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, they have significant and powerful asymmetric capabilities. I read a report yesterday that noted that the majority of combat drones in use in the world today are now Iranian. Think about that. That's a sobering thought, and of course it also speaks to the inefficiency and effectiveness of many of our sanctions regimes that we've applied against Iran. I found it also very interesting that when President-elect Biden, after he was elected, but before Inauguration Day, he was interviewed. He said that he noted, we're going to go forward, we're going to try to reach some form of nuclear agreement with Iran, and then we're going to address reductions in controls for their missile force. The response was swift from Iranian leaders. In an excellent article on Iran's military capabilities, New Yorker journalist Robin Wright quoted President Raisi, regional issues or the missile issue are non-negotiable. In other words, there's never going to be a linkage between nuclear negotiations and their missile force. In fact, I'd go a step further. I'd say greater possibility of negotiations on nuclear matters than there is on the ballistic missile force, the cruise missile force, and the drones. We should remember that the drones and the missiles are capable of being fired this afternoon. That's not some future threat 18 months or 24 months down the road. They can employ those today in the region against neighbors such as UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, unlikely, but possible, Kuwait, and other, particularly the Gulf countries. Now, I don't believe that the Iranians seek a war with the United States or any of our allies and partners, and I specifically include Israel in this. We have achieved a rough measure of deterrence for state-on-state attacks. What the Iranians want, in my view, is sanctions relief and the ability to expand their economy. At the same time, and typical of the baffling and complex nature of Iranian decision-making, they continue to pursue the ejection of the United States from the region and the destruction of the state of Israel. They see Iraq as the principal battleground for this. And for the past few years, the Iranians believe they could achieve our departure from Iraq through political action, forcing the government of Iraq to ask us to leave. This didn't work out, and it's not going to work out in the future despite the reporting that's out there. We're going to remain in Iraq at some level. These things highlight the essential schizophrenia of the Iranian approach. The idea that they can push for sanctions relief and some form of nuclear negotiation, while at the same time attacking us directly in Iraq and Syria. By the summer of 2022, it was increasingly obvious that there was no possibility of a return to the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was in place at the end of the Obama administration to talk about limits on Iranian nuclear capability. We were simply too far apart. Moreover, the Iranians were creeping closer and closer to the point where they would have enough fissile material for a bomb. This was concerning, but it's important to remember that having enough fissile material is only part of the equation. The bomb needs to be weaponized. You get the fissile material, you've got what we would call a test article, a big thing that would take up most of this stage and is not practically deliverable. Like, you can blow it up in your lab, which is not where you want to do it. So it's not practically military useful. You need to make it small enough to be transported. You got to build a delivery system. Probably take a year and a half, maybe longer to do that. You have to solve the problem of reentry at theater depth, 1,000 miles or more. Those are complex problems. It remains my opinion today that the best way to keep Iranians from possessing a nuclear weapon remains some form of a diplomatic agreement, however unsatisfying and incomplete parts of it may be. The worst way is through military action against their nuclear program, either by us or what we euphemistically at CENTCOM used to call a third party, the Israelis. Here's a point though. The less you know about the problems and risks inherent in a strike, the more positive about its potential success one tends to be. It's a difficult problem. In 2011, this was a vastly different and easier problem. I was the CENTCOM planner for General Mattis in 2011. The Iranian air defenses were less developed than what's in place now. And I worked those contingency plans for over 10 years. I'm a subject matter expert on the problem. Today and in the future, it would be very hard to destroy their entire program with all its components. The material, vast tons of fissile material, the warhead research and design, the missile design and construction, and of course the human capital, the brains that actually put it all together. And that gets harder every passing day to accomplish that. Moreover, a strike like that's going to undoubtedly trigger a significant response from the Iranians. A strike against their nuclear program would be an act of war, and they would almost certainly release that massive fleet of missiles, drones, and land attack cruise missiles that I talked about. So here's the lesson. We shouldn't talk about striking Iran's nuclear program unless we're prepared for the inevitable theater war that will follow. It will be a bloody and violent fires war where our bases and the cities of our regional friends are going to be targeted. It's wishful thinking to believe that we can decouple an Iranian counterattack from a nuclear strike. This means what we need, that if you're going to do that, you need to prepare the theater well in advance for that kind of an operation. Many of the capabilities and resources we once enjoyed in the region have been removed. Or uncertain and often conflicting signals about our plans for long-term presence in the region have eroded our ability to gain access to basing and overflight. We have to be able to base in the region, and we have to be able to overfly several countries if we ever need to fight Iran. If it continues to be our national policy to de-emphasize the region and to reduce our posture and relationships in the Middle East, then we actually need to suppress our appetite for potential kinetic action against Iran. To not resolve these tensions if we contemplate a strike is strategic malpractice of the highest order. There's one bit of good news that has come about as a result of the rise of Iranian capabilities, their provocative actions, and the drumbeat of messages from the U.S. about drawing down in the Middle East. Countries in the region are increasingly worried about Iranian capabilities, particularly the ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and UAVs that I just talked about. These countries place less and less faith in their relationship with the United States as a protector. Counterintuitively, to some degree, this has had the effect of drawing them together. When there's a common adversary, there's opportunity. State and non-state groups around the Middle East recognize the growing threat from Iran's airborne arsenal and the inherent instability that attends it. There's a potential opportunity in a form of a collective defense against air and missile threats. A key development in that opportunity was the addition of Israel into the Central Command area of responsibility in 2021. I worked very hard for this while in command, and I consider it to be one of my most important contributions. It was far more than symbolic. And here's why. The air and missile defense domain is an area where countries can cooperate to varying degrees. It's mainly about the prompt sharing of information, radar sensor data, signals and imagery intelligence, A nation doesn't have to either accept foreign forces onto their own territory or station its own forces abroad to participate. This fact and the imminence of the threat have created a sweet spot for cooperation. Since my days as a CENTCOM strategist in 2010, 2012, increased cooperation in this area has been a goal of CENTCOM. In 2021 and after, it changed. First in August of 2021, and then again in March of 2022, I met with chiefs of defense of many of the nations in the Gulf, including Israel. Our goals were to find actionable, practical ways to share air and missile warnings and to develop a set of responses that we could employ rapidly. What set these meetings apart was the fact that there was significant preparatory work conducted in advance. Staff officers met and conferred. Information and capabilities were shared. The final meetings I attended represented only a snapshot in the long continuum of planning that had begun years earlier. We didn't meet just to meet. We met to take action at the military level. This cooperation offers great opportunities to deter Iran and to create a structure upon which nations in the region can continue to build. For example, cooperation at sea is another domain that's ripe for exploitation. Moving ahead will require additional political unity and buy-in by the nations involved, because most of what we were doing, was at the military level. You need to go to the Minister of Defense level and eventually to the head of state level. As with everything in this region, the process will be halting and uncertain, but I believe we've actually taken the first nascent steps towards some form of a regional collective security architecture. It's not NATO. It will never be NATO, and we shouldn't expect it to be NATO, but it can be far more than what we've had in the past. There's a way forward here. Additionally, we've had modest success in Iraq, where Iraqi security forces have proven able to take on ISIS with lower levels of U.S. support. Our NATO partners are also involved in Iraq, and the trends for their continued engagement are favorable, although the war in Ukraine has slowed the NATO process. Iraq can become an island of relative stability in the very center of the region, but it will take continued engagement by not only the military element of power, but also sustained economic and diplomatic assistance. The entry of Israel into the region in a military sense, as they joined CENTCOM, also provides opportunities. Coupled with the Abraham Accords, there's slow but certain momentum on the part of Arab states to open up to Israel. It will not come quickly, but all in the region recognize the immense military capabilities that Israel brings, and these may prove useful to a region with reduced American presence. I want to note that the war in Gaza that we see right now certainly has affected this momentum, but I don't believe it will end this momentum. I believe the momentum is actually inevitable going forward. And while there may be bumps in the road because of this, I believe that in the capitals of Saudi Arabia and UAE, there's grave concern over the Iranian threat, and that trumps any other consideration ultimately as we go forward. So we have a great opportunity here. As we go throughout the day-to-day, other speakers are going to talk in far greater detail about what's going on in Iran. It truly is I'm fascinated with Iran. I've studied it many years. It's an imperial culture. Most Americans, when they think of Iran, they think of 1979, 78, 79, when our hostages were taken, when the Iranian Revolution occurred. The Iranians tend to take a longer view, and they began in the early 1950s when we deposed a sitting government and reinstalled the Shah. And actually, the Iranians think back thousands of years. We should recognize that. They think in deep time. That is a struggle we have always had in the United States to match that depth of thought. And if we're going to play the long game with Iran, we need to know and understand that. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to hear the other speakers today. Thank you.